This video is sponsored by Incogni. Believe it or not, Canada is in the midst of a cultural civil war. Canada's reputation shines brightly across the world. It boasts some of the highest international rankings of any country when it comes to measurements of quality of life, economic freedom, education levels, public services, and environmental sustainability. If you're on the outside looking in, particularly if you're experiencing economic hardship in the US, you might see Canada as a relative utopia and one of the world's most attractive places to live. But many Canadians who actually live within the country's borders are arguing the complete opposite. Canada is a dystopian nightmare, and the truth is that the country is quickly becoming a shell of its former self. With drugs being handed out for free in the streets, tireless arguments over gender identity and multiculturalism, controversial healthcare policies, and increasingly devastating house prices, Canada is becoming parallel to the United States in all the wrong ways. Although Canada still ranks above the US in overall happiness in 2023, the gap has been closing quickly over the years, and Canada's happiness index has dipped below a 7 out of 10 for the first time ever in 2022. And even though it comes with an upfront cost in taxes, Canadian citizens' access to universal healthcare, affordable education, and public services have generally kept them high on the list of the world's happiest countries over the years. None of this has changed, so what has? Well, one possible factor is that Canadian citizens right now are in a constant battle with one another. The rise of sensationalized coverage and hot takes surrounding controversial issues and policy has consumed the minds of many. Left or right, nearly everyone finds themselves on one side of the culture war there, taking constant vitriol from the other side. Despite only having a direct effect on a relatively small portion of the Canadian population, there are several singular issues that are completely overtaking the national discourse. One of these issues is the regulated distribution of free and tested heroin, methamphetamines, cocaine, and fentanyl to the country's drug-using population in urban areas. Essentially, if you have a history of drug addiction and haven't been able to kick the habit through other treatments, you can walk into a clinic and receive hard and dangerous drugs from the Canadian government, all for a minimal cost. This sounds insane and sinister, so what's the justification here? Well, the movement is called Safer Supply, and according to the Canadian government's website, they're providing prescribed medications as a safer alternative to the toxic illegal drug supply to people who are at high risk of overdose. The idea is that by providing drug users with controlled doses and chemically pure versions of the drug they seek, it will keep them from seeking drugs from shady drug dealers, and ultimately limit the amount of accidental overdoses amongst the population. But obviously, this sort of program is bound to be controversial. Opponents against safe injection sites argue that people with drug problems are unfairly receiving free services, as they suggest that taxpayers would be subsidizing illicit drug use. But perhaps more prevalent is the argument that providing drugs to the population and increasing drug supply actually creates more drug addiction, more crime, more homelessness, and worse sanitary conditions in Canada's major cities. People against safer supply programs have noted visible increases in all of these problems, which were already plaguing Canada's metropolitan areas. But what do the statistics tell us? Is safer supply helping or hurting the Canadian population? Well, Canada reported 7,328 deaths from apparent opioid overdoses in 2022, which is actually 9% lower than the record high the previous year. However, this isn't a significant enough decrease to tell us the Safer Supply program is working just yet, especially considering total apparent opioid toxicity deaths have been growing steadily since 2016. Now, if we take a look at crime rates in Canada, violent crime has been steadily increasing every year since 2014, and since the introduction of safer supply programs in 2019, these percentage increases have simply remained consistent. And if we specifically look at drug-related offences, they've actually decreased by 17% in 2022. And we can also analyse the cost of safe injection programs to Canadian taxpayers, because in 2023, Canada announced a $144 million allocation to support Health Canada's substance use and addictions program. In particular, their projects including Safer Supply. This sounds like a lot, and it is, but considering the fact that Canadian citizens spend an estimated $46 billion in non-taxable illegal drug markets as of 2017, and the fact that taxpayers are already funding countless drug treatment programs that have so far been proven to be ineffective, a program like Safer Supply, which has showed some promise in reducing drug-related crime, may save the Canadian taxpayers in the long term with more investment. But the question is this morally right for the government to give these people drugs for free? Or similar to the phenomena we see in the US and the UK, this question has saturated the greater media machine in Canada, as they're capitalising on the shock of a headline, perpetuating what's entertaining liberal and conservative news outlets, presenting one side of an issue to appease their audience, while simultaneously sucking out all the nuance. And this is the tip of the iceberg, dividing the population of Canada. But before we continue, I want to tell you about our video sponsor Incogni. Did you know data breaches are skyrocketing? The 2022 annual data breach report reveals a whopping 41.5% increase in victims from the previous year. Your personal information is likely out there being traded, sold, and displayed without your consent, as commercial databases are growing rapidly and they have your data. And yet to manually remove yourself from these databases would take years, and you need to redo it every few months. And in the US specifically, people's search sites are detailing your life online. Sites like Being Verified showcase your home address, contacts, financial details, and even your beliefs, putting you at great risk of scams, identity theft, online harassment, and even threats to your loved ones. And that's where today's sponsor Incogni comes to the rescue. All you need to do is just sign up to Incogni and tell them whose data needs protection. You then authorize them access, and they'll do everything to protect your privacy, contacting data brokers and demanding your data's removal. And then you just sit back and they keep you informed at every turn, helping to destroy numerous data brokers peddling extensive data to firms that specifically target susceptible and underprivileged demographics, helping to destroy the growing fraudsters that are now leveraging AI to replicate the voice of close loved ones, deceiving people into transferring money to these people. And it's these deceitful tactics that are wholly dependent on voice data that is accessible through these data brokers. And specifically, people's search platforms in the US are openly displaying your private details, even encompassing family-related information. There was even an instance recently where the children of a child welfare professional were identified on a data broker platform associated with her. But you can avoid all of this and stop this with Incogni. And the first 100 people to use code MOONREAL at the link below will also get 60% off of Incogni at incogni.com/moonreal. You see, in the broader scheme of things, this scheme is fairly small. And Canada has many big problems happening right now. The death of free speech, controlled media, the stripping of individual rights, all of these huge problems. And yet this small story about the government policy giving out free drugs to addicts is being used to generate far more attention than a bland story about economic and social freedom that has been taken away from Canadians. Even though this will have a far greater effect on the day-to-day lives and survival of the greater majority. And don't get the sentiment wrong. Of course, the drug epidemic in Canada is a massive issue and not one to be ignored. It affects plenty of people every day and more people than just addicts. But the safer supply movement specifically isn't really affecting people as much as we're led to believe. Discourse is completely disproportionate to the actual tangible effects. Instead, the media creates outrage and passionate stances surrounding a policy that really has very little effect in the grand scheme of things, just because it's entertaining and therefore profitable. And this problem of selective spread of information stands to become far worse in the coming years, because while Canadians are caught up constantly regurgitating the woke and anti-woke rhetoric surrounding safer supply and all the other pillars of this national culture war, policymakers are actually passing bills into law that will change how Canadians perceive the world around them every day, with very minimal resistance or support from a distracted public. Bill C-11 and Bill C-18 have just become laws in Canada that are set to change the way citizens consume entertainment and news forever with strict censorship. But Bill C-11 is a new law that updates Canada's broadcast laws, giving the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission the power to regulate streaming platforms such as Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime and Spotify. The bill requires streaming platforms to promote Canadian content, including films, TV shows, music and music videos, and contribute financially to their production. This means that the CRTC has the power to limit the reach of media from foreign sources within Canada and allow them to further control what content is pushed to the masses. And if they decide to, the CRTC can now push media with messaging that benefits the government's agenda, while silencing media that doesn't. On top of that, it discourages major streamers from producing projects by Canadian creators by making it more expensive to do so. But perhaps even more alarming is Bill C-18. Bill C-18 is legislation that will force tech companies such as Google and Meta to negotiate compensation deals with Canadian news organizations for posting or linking to their work. The federal government has said that the bill will help the Canadian news industry, which has seen large amounts of advertising revenue migrate to Google and Facebook. The legislation would allow news outlets to reach private deals with the tech companies. If an agreement cannot be reached, news outlets will go to CRTC for mediation. However, this law has already started to backfire. On August 1st, Meta announced that it's removing news on Instagram and Facebook for all Canadian users, and other tech and social media giants could follow suit. Meta spokesperson Andy Stone took to Twitter to explain the company's stance. As we've always said, the law is based on a fundamentally flawed premise, and regrettably, the only way we can reasonably comply is to end news availability in Canada. And if a domino effect does occur, causing other companies to follow in Meta's footsteps, Canadian citizens will now have to change the way they stay informed, and do more to seek out news for themselves online. And realistically, most people won't go through that effort. So instead of occasionally stumbling across information about world events or national policy, a majority of the Canadian public will find themselves falling deeper into a hole of memes and unchecked misinformation. Corporations and policymakers will be able to push legislation that hurts people with fewer people noticing, and the distraction that makes it possible for them to do so becomes easier to execute. And at the forefront of current distraction in Canada is the next pillar of its culture war: gender identity. More specifically, government policies regarding gender-affirming treatment and children. Right now in Canada, minors have access to treatment for transitioning their gender in most jurisdictions. Now, the argument for minors having this access is so that people can get a sense of their gender identities and sexual orientations from a very young age.
The current crop of especially trans, quote-unquote trans kids, they're the guinea pigs. We're experimenting on them. And they're making a lot of, the healthcare providers are making a lot of promises about how this is going to turn out when they can't possibly know this because we've never done it before.
And hormone therapy and gender reaffirming surgeries are supposed to be far more effective before natural puberty, and this is supposed to give them a happier life in the future. Yet many people would see this policy with dismay, arguing that children below the age of 18 are still in the process of figuring out who the hell they even are, especially lacking the foresight to make such a large, irreversible decision at such a young age. So parents who let their children make this choice are setting themselves up for a life of possible regret, with many like Jordan Peterson seeing this as child abuse.
So the joint probability that you have a trans kid and a pansexual kid is 1 in 9 million. The odds that you're a pathological narcissist sacrificing your own children to the glorification of your compassion is 8,999,999 to 1. So like, do you have a trans kid and a pansexual kid, or are you a devouring mother? Well, you can look at the odds and decide for yourself.
So the question is, why is all of this happening? And why in particular is this seemingly happening to Canada? Well, this is obviously a huge issue in Canada. People everywhere are outraged. There is a constant culture war going on about this stuff. And obviously I can't go too much into it because of YouTube censorship. But one important thing here is that all of this trans stuff affects such a small percentage of people. Less than 1% of transgender children even undergo any sort of gender-affirming care, and this really only happens when parents and physicians fear the worst. And via a survey conducted in Canada and the US in 2021, including children and adults, a very tiny percentage of people are even trans. For the vast majority, it's been reported that only 1% regret their decisions. Now, of course some do, and in these cases this is horrifically tragic and an awful event. In fact, this whole thing is just awful and twisted. And of course there's a culture war debate about it, but at the same time, this only affects a handful of people in the real world. How many people is this affecting in the society? Almost no one's getting this treatment, almost nobody wants it, almost nobody's trans, and more importantly, most people in Canada remain completely unaffected by these policies, and the Canadians who are affected by these policies are generally satisfied with the way they're written. But the news gives you a whole other side of this, as though this is affecting everything. Canadians everywhere are arguing at the dinner table over transgender children now, something that just seems so deranged. Everywhere you look on this debate, people are spending hours and hours in comment sections arguing with people who they've never met or seen, all arguing over an issue that statistically will never affect them personally. It becomes more about one team winning rather than tangible change. And just like the safer supply, bad actors in the government are capitalizing off all of this outrage. In fact, this whole thing might actually be orchestrated by these people to distract from the fact that Canada is now completely censoring free speech within the country. And so while the Canadian population remains distracted by hot button issues such as this, the real factors contributing to their unhappiness are spiraling further out of control. Average hourly wages in Canada have completely stagnated and even decreased in recent years. Meanwhile, inflation and the cost of living have completely skyrocketed. And while overall median household income has risen consistently, it's not keeping up with the cost of basic needs like food, transportation, education, and housing, especially the latter. Like other Western countries, Canada is currently experiencing a housing crisis. Scarcity of affordable housing, artificial inflation of the rental market by private property management companies, and constant increases in the variable rate mortgages mortgages have destroyed any hopes for young Canadians hoping to buy a home and start a family. It's also caused an increase in homelessness, as more and more people are getting priced out of the housing market entirely and finding themselves on the streets. It's currently estimated that 1 in 5 young adults live in unaffordable housing and spend 30% or more of their pre-tax income on housing costs. The average rent in Canada is increasing by nearly 10% every year, while salaries are rising at less than half that rate. And this year, mortgage rates in Canada have been increasing at an unsustainable rate, with the speed of mortgage increases doubling since last year and hitting a 5-year high. And even if you're someone in the rare position of having access to affordable housing, the ripple effects of this are felt by everyone, because as housing costs become a higher percentage of a household's annual income, less of their income will be disposable. And less disposable income means a dearth of spending power from the majority of consumers. And when the consumers are spending less, businesses fail, stock prices plummet, people get laid off, the gap between income and cost of living gets worse, perpetuating the source of the problem and ultimately strangling consumer spending power further, until eventually the economy collapses. So whether you're one of the many currently experiencing housing insecurity or not, a mass housing crisis will likely affect your livelihood. So how is the Canadian government actually addressing this? Well, they're not. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just announced the federal government's first act towards fighting the Canadian housing crisis, and it's excruciatingly underwhelming. Trudeau announced a plan to provide London, Ontario with $74 million to build 2,000 homes in the city, and this sounds like a step in the right direction until you consider the context. Nearly 2 years ago, $4 billion was added to the federal budget to address the housing crisis, and since then, not a single housing project has been built with this money. Instead, Trudeau has cited strict red tape and zoning laws as barriers, putting out empty calls for city governments to, quote, step up and address the crisis. Not exactly what you want to hear from the most powerful man in the country. On top of this, 2,000 homes in almost 2 years is nowhere near enough to even make a dent in solving the problem. Experts estimate that Canada needs to build over 3.5 million housing units by 2030 to even close this affordability gap. So this is a problem for a majority of Canadians, a major one with effects that could ruin countless lives. However, discourse about the housing crisis seems generally disinterested, and any noise about it ultimately gets drowned out by the amplification of stories and narratives that are more visceral, attention-grabbing and clickable. And in turn, people are spending their energy mobilizing for and against hyper-specific causes that will likely never touch their lives or taking their eye of a meteor hurtling towards the economy. These issues of safer supply, gender-affirming care, and things like MAID are of course huge moral questions in society, and there's a whole bunch of issues with all of these things, but their effects on the wider population and Canadians' everyday lives isn't really affecting the average citizen. But this bigger, wider stuff is. The lack of freedom of speech, the growing control of Justin Trudeau as he becomes more and more dystopian. The fact that Canada is becoming unaffordable for most people is the real issue that's not spoken about anywhere near enough, because the constant noise of left v right, a false media paradigm, the world expecting you to have an informed opinion on every issue, the constant anger and fear of speaking out of turn is unsurprisingly having an adverse effect on the mental health of the general public. You see, the top 3 descriptors Canadians offer for the culture war debates in their country right now are divisive, exhausting, and unnecessary. And these sentiments are extremely similar to what's expressed by citizens of the United States, a country that has also been divided by its own culture wars for years. And although Canada is in the relatively early stages of this phenomena, the writing is on the wall for them, especially when we take a look at how mental health has declined in the United States, since the fragile illusion of bipartisanism was finally broken. And as Canada becomes more and more woke, as Justin Trudeau cracks down even more on freedom, and Canadians become more and more unhappy, we're going to see a new crisis within Canada. And you don't have to look far to see what's happening. In America, 90% of adults in the US believe their country is facing a mental health crisis. Anxiety and depression screenings are increasing by over 90% and 60% respectively per year. And perhaps more telling is that fear of widespread civil unrest is at an all-time high, with nearly half of Americans believing a full-on civil war will happen in the next decade. So this begs the question, what's on the horizon for Canada? Well, it's looking more likely that the Conservative Party of Canada will finally beat Trudeau. Maybe this could be a positive change for Canada, because after 8 years of being in charge, almost all of Canada now finally hates Justin Trudeau and his fake plastic veneer, with his approval rating plummeting down to a new low of just 19% over the summer, which isn't a surprise considering the drastic transformation Canada has had in recent years, going from a free and open society to a morally bankrupt hellhole. Obviously he doesn't appeal to the right, but even to the left, he's made things more expensive, less free, and hasn't done anything to help Canadian citizens. Because Canadians right now are feeling economic pressure, citing the economy and inflation as their core concerns, with no solution from Trudeau's government on the horizon.
So an Abacus poll from July found that most of the country has a negative impression of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The worst results he's ever had.
It seems these days, wherever the Prime Minister goes, there's often a contingent of so-called Freedom Convoy protesters there to greet him. And that was no exception at this week's cabinet retreat here in Hamilton, where protesters camped out front the hotel the Prime Minister, his cabinet, and entire staff were staying at for several evenings this week. They even surrounded the restaurant the Prime Minister was dining at last night.
So while financial hardship weighs down more and more Canadians, Trudeau's pandering words and socially focused policies ring more empty by the day. As a result, Canadians on both sides of the political spectrum are seeking change, more specifically change that addresses their core economic concerns.
We've got 8 years of a Liberal government that has ignored this problem, that hasn't taken the right action, and really has been a failure. Costs of homes have gone up, cost of rent has gone up under 8 years of Liberal government.
And Trudeau's rival Conservative Party leader has recognized this, focusing his messaging on pocketbook economic issues over culture wars.
He has no direct or indirect involvement with the Trudeau Foundation? Really? Because the annual report for 21-22 lists him as an inactive member and says that he is only withdrawn from the affairs of the foundation for the duration of his involvement in federal politics, meaning he can go back to that big pile of cash when he leaves office.
This strategy is paying dividends in the polls, with the Conservative Party leader beating Trudeau by over 10%. But if he's elected, it won't mark an end to the culture wars plaguing Canadian politics. It'll just be the beginning. The Conservative Party leader is called Pierre Poilievre, and recently he's been shifting his focus away from the current culture wars, but his party isn't. Conservative provincial premiers are still heavily leaning into and perpetuating the culture wars, shaping their platforms almost entirely around socially conservative policies that take aim at Trudeau's woke ideology. And whilst he does attack the gender-affirming care and all this child trans stuff, what are they going to do about the rest of the stuff? This is easy pickings. What about Bill C-11 and Bill C-18? Is any of this stuff ever actually going to change? Is the economic crisis going to change? It seems no matter the outcome of the next federal election, whether Trudeau or Poilievre, the Canadian culture wars will continue to rage on, and all these distractions and noise will continue to swirl whilst the actual economy slips down the drain, with freedom going down the gutter with it, with Canada going headfirst into a catastrophic doom cycle, becoming a warning to the rest of the Western world of exactly what you shouldn't do as a country.